So, continuing our study of the book of Revelation, we began to introduce chapter 12 last week. Chapter 12 being one of, if not the most difficult chapters of the book of Revelation as far as interpretation and understanding what's going on in the things that we see and read in that 12th chapter. Now, I identified several keys to understanding the chapter last week, and we began to look at a couple of these. We talked about the context of what was going on prior to chapter 12. Primarily, chapter 11 would be a good chapter to look at as far as the prior events that are going on, and then what follows afterward through chapter 18. So chapter 12 fits right in the middle of that. So we have to look at the occurrence of chapter 12 in light of its place in context. And then we talked some about the being a symbol that John says he saw a sign. And this word sign is one of the Greek words that is often used not just for the image itself that you see, but there is a meaning, there is an intention with this. And the word sign here really refers to something that is not a part of the normal, usual occurrences of life. So, as we look into the chapter, we'll see a woman who is expecting a baby. Nothing unusual about that in life. But it's the fact that it's this woman. And that's where the sign, the meaning of the sign comes into play. It's the fact that this woman is having a child is what's important. So chapter 12 has a lot of symbolism. It has some literalness to it, but there's some stated symbolism. And then time frames. Different commentators will say chapter 12 refers going all the way back to the fall of Lucifer and the cross and all of these things. But really, in reading chapter 12, the time frames of what happens is basically looking forward. So we're seeing chapter 12 occur in the midst of the 7 years, which is the length of the Great Tribulation period. So the time frame, this chapter 12 looks forward to the last 3.5 years of the tribulation period. So if we think about this in that light, understanding that that the time frame, and we've seen several ways of this being listed, the 1,260 days, 42 months, times and a half a time, and 3.5 years. All of these basically are referring to the same time period, as far as time goes. So this scene that John is seeing, this sign, is something that looks forward in time, not back. And then we have the word snatched, or King James Version has the word caught up. So let's think about this a little bit. The word is a translation of a Hebrew word. The Greek word is a translation of a Hebrew word. And the Hebrew word basically means to be plucked or snatched. It's used in the book of Amos, chapter 4, verse 11, and Zechariah, chapter 3, verse 2, of a narrow escape or a rescuing by God's forceful intervention. You'll see that Old Testament word used. And I think in one of the passages it talks about Israel being plucked as a firebrand from the fire. That word plucked in that Old Testament passage is the Old Testament word that is carried over into the New Testament. God's protection in those Old Testament passages is what is talked about, not so much a transferring of location. So when you think about the snatched, and I'm referring to these, and we'll cover these verses as we go through it. The word snatch comes up in verse 5. She gave birth to a son, a male child who will rule all the nations with an iron scepter, and her child was snatched up, New International Version, to God and to his throne. Now, in the New Testament, the Greek word used here is used to translate the Hebrew word. The Old Testament, when it was translated into Greek, this is the Greek word that was used then, and it's used here in this passage. And the root word, harpazo, means to snatch away or catch away. And the verb conveys the idea of force that is suddenly exercised or used. This is the word that is used in Acts chapter 8, verse 39, of Philip being called away after baptizing the Ethiopian eunuch. The passage says there in Acts chapter 8 that Philip was called away. This is the word that was used, and he was literally picked up and moved to another place to carry on his believing, his ministry. This is also the word that is used in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verse 17, for the rapture of living believers, that those that are dead will not prevent or precede we who are alive. So the dead will rise first, and then we who are alive shall be caught up. That word, caught up, in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verse 17, is this Greek word that is used here. So, in the two places of the New Testament, this word is used of the picking up and moving. But in looking at its historical background from the Old Testament, the snatching of chapter 12, verse 5 doesn't necessarily mean a rapture or a sudden physical change in location, although a location change can't be ruled out depending upon the context. Now, the passage states that the child was caught up to heaven. But again, this could be a reference to the protection of God. Called up to God is that he is protected by him. We saw this in looking at the measuring of chapter 11, verse 1, where John was told to measure the holy place and the court and the worshippers. So we talked about that word measured, that John obviously wasn't seeing how tall or how short people were. That wasn't the point. The measuring of chapter 11, verse 1 was showing the dividing line between those who would be protected and those who would not be protected. So I think in looking at the word snatched here in this passage, we need to think about it in the same kind of idea. It's not so much that this child was taken totally away and protected, but that the child may very well have been protected by the Lord, is what the intention is of that. Now, questions on that? I don't know if that is as clear as I try to make it sound. So in thinking about this word snatched, unless you believe in a mid-tribulation rapture, we are nowhere told that the Jewish remnant is raptured away at the beginning of the Jewish revival. And we've already seen that the time frame of this is mid-tribulation forward. So this is not looking back. Some commentaries you read will say this is referring to the birth of Jesus. But Jesus wasn't raptured away either when he was born. And the time frame of 3.5 years does not equate with the time that they were in Egypt. None of that fits. So the time frame becomes essential in understanding really the rest of this whole set of keys in understanding the 12th chapter of Revelation. So I really think that this word snatched would be better translated as protected. Not just picked up and called away as protected. in the sense of rapture. Now, could protected mean a change of location? Yeah, you could include that. But really look at it from the standpoint of being protected, not raptured. So don't think of that snatched as a rapture as much as a protection. And then verses 1 through 6 of the 12th chapter really are expanded upon in the rest of the chapter, verses 7 through verse 17. So when we look at this chapter, these 6 verses present the scene. These help explain in greater detail what John saw in the first 6 verses. Questions? Need to go over something again so it's a little clearer? Need to go over it again so it's even more confusing, whatever works, But I think these are important in understanding what's going on in chapter 12. That's why I've spent some time in looking at them. Now, let's look into the chapter. New International Version. A great and wondrous sign appeared in heaven. A woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and a crown of 12 stars on her head. She was pregnant and cried out in pain as she was about to give birth. Now, who is the woman? She is described in this passage as being clothed with the sun. The moon is under her feet, and 12 stars on her head. I would draw you a picture of this, but any of you who have seen my artwork would probably say, no, you don't need to. But you can just imagine that. Now, in thinking about that description of this woman, there is no similar description given in the Bible to any other entity. And due to there not being any other exact description of any other person in Scripture like this, this has resulted in a whole lot of interpretations as to who this person is. All the way from it being Mary, the mother of Jesus, to being some combination of constellation, the sun, stars, and planets. I mean, if you look it up, you'll see all of these things. None of which I think answers the point and describes who this woman is. Now, in thinking about the description, clothed with the sun, moon under her feet, 12 stars on her head, the closest that we have to this description is Joseph's dream back in the book of Genesis, chapter 37, verse 9. And in that dream, the sun, moon, and stars represented Joseph's family. It was Isaac, his family, his mother, and his brothers. Remember, that's what they got so jealous about and sold him into Egypt for talking about his dream. So, even though that's not the same description as we see here, I think the elements used there are a clue as to what we need to understand as to who this woman is. These elements represented the family of Israel. Joseph's father, his mother, and his brother. They were the patriarchal family of Israel. So I think we would be safe in looking at this description of these elements, moon under her feet, stars upon her head, clothed with the sun, as being representative of the family of Israel. Now, the figure of the sun and moon is used by God in Psalms 89, verses 36 and 37, And in that passage, it describes the promise of the endurance of the line of David. Once again, you have the sun and moon being used as representing the family of Israel. In that passage, the promise of the line of David. So, in thinking about who the woman is, we go back and recognize our keys and our context here. So, this context about the family of Israel having the promise of God has to relate to what is going on in the midst of the 7 years and forward to the end of that 7-year period. So, one of the more telling passages that helps us understand who this woman comes from Isaiah chapter 60. That whole chapter speaks of Israel's glory in the millennial age. And verses 19 and 20 of that 60th chapter declare that God will be the light of this people in that day, and neither sun or moon will fade anymore. So it's talking about the glory of what is going to be for Israel. So in light of all of these things, I think that this woman represents Israel as they are, as a nation and a people in the tribulation period. She has the promise of God upon her, even though Israel's history is that of rebellion, and even now in the tribulation period, as a nation, she's following Antichrist. Remember, he's built a temple for her. And the two witnesses are murdered in Jerusalem and are left laying in the street for 3.5 days in Jerusalem. So, this woman represents the nation and people of Israel as they are in the tribulation period, or what is often called the time of Jacob's trouble. And even though they currently are following Antichrist, they rejected the two witnesses and probably the 144,000 evangelists as well as the rest of the world. Even though they have done this, they still are under the promise of God as a nation. There's an interesting passage, Romans chapter 11, verses 25 through 28. I want to read that to you. It's a powerful statement that Paul makes. Chapter 11, verse 25 through 28. I do not want you to be ignorant of this mystery, brothers. And he's talking about Israel, what's going to happen to them, the fact they've been rejected and the Gentiles are brought in and so forth. So that you may not be conceited. He's wanting the Gentile believers to recognize, yes, you have the gospel that is shared with you. But now don't get the big head and think that you really, as a people, Gentile people, are above Israel. That's the conceit, which has happened all through the centuries from that first century. And he says, Israel has experienced a hardening in part until the full number of the Gentiles has come in. And so all Israel will be saved, as it is written, the deliverer will come from Zion, he will turn godlessness away from Jacob, and this is my covenant with them when I take away their sins. And here's the statement here, verse 28. As far as the gospel is concerned, they are enemies on your account. And the Jews were enemies of the gospel, and still are. But as far as election is concerned, the choosing of God, they are loved on account of the patriot. Now that's a powerful statement. Paul is acknowledging that, yeah, they're going to fight you as believers. They're not going to believe it. They're not going to accept the gospel. It's evident even in the tribulation period. They're not going to accept the gospel. It's beginning to come in, but they're not going to accept it. But they still, as a people, are chosen by God to be His chosen nation. Shouldn't be a news flash, but it may be to some people. America isn't God's chosen nation. Never has been. Never will be. No other nation has been God's chosen people, although we have claimed it as Americans. The British claimed it back in the 1700s. Spain has claimed it, right on down through history. They've claimed to be God's chosen people because they won the battles. And so they wanted to get that divine right on their side. But the only nation that has ever been the chosen nation of God, and still is the Jewish nation. And that's Paul said it there so that we as Gentiles will kind of recognize who we really are. We are not the chosen people. Israel is still the chosen people of God. And as a nation, they will be exalted to the lead nation of earth during the millennium. So, even though they are rejecting the gospel, up until the time at least of the murder of the two witnesses, their promise as a nation is that of glory. And Romans chapter 11 is very clear on presenting that. Okay, questions, comments, statements? Irritations?
It's almost where we become the prodigal son, or not the prodigal son, but the story of the prodigal son, right? So we're all sitting there going, wait a minute, these guys said the whole time have never accepted it, and now all of a sudden they want to accept, right?
Yeah.
So we would be all standing there going like, hey,
Yeah. Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean,
think
you
so.
can easily see how people would do that, but
Yeah.
I mean, especially in a country where everybody's about me,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Very much so. Yeah. Yeah. And all through history, we as a Gentile people have looked at the Jews as the ones who have crucified Christ, and they said to Pilate, His blood be on us and on our children. Well, yeah, it has been. But at the same time, we have been grafted, as Paul says, in the same set in chapter 9 through 11 of Romans. We've been grafted into the vine. As a wild bush, we've been grafted into it. Israel has been put out for a while, but they're coming back. Not to replace us, but God has just wanted us to know, these are the people that I chose. And they are my people. Whatever they've done, they're still my people. I just want you, as a believer, to remember that. That's what he's trying to say to us, so that we don't, become, as Paul said, conceited in the fact that we have salvation and they don't. So, this is the woman, Israel, in the tribulation period. Now, if something pops up in your mind, don't hesitate to ask me. Now, we're going to skip verses 3 and 4. We're going to come back to them. But we're going to look at, okay, who's the baby? Who's the child? The passage says that she cried out in pain, verse 2, as she was about to give birth. Verse 5. She gave birth to a son, a male child, who will rule all the nations with an iron scepter. And her child was snatched up to God and to his throne. The woman fled into the desert to a place prepared for her by God, where she might be taken care of for 1,260 days. Now, the passage says that she's pregnant and in the last stages of labor. And as we've talked about, the fact that a woman is pregnant and in the last stages of labor is nothing unusual. So the fact that this woman is about to give birth is the unusual thing. The fact that rejecting Israel is about to give birth, there's where the meaning of the sign comes into play. And this is what's unusual, that this people, this nation, is about to give birth to a child. Now, there's two passages that help us in interpreting this child. And both are set in scriptures that talk about Israel restoration in the end time. First passage is Micah chapter 4, verses 9 and 10. The second passage is chapter 5, verse 3 of that same book, Micah. And both of those passages speak of Israel being in pain and abandoned until the time she who is in labor gives birth, and the rest of his brothers return to join the Israelites. That's the statement out of chapter 5, verse 3. And there's another passage that I want to refer you to that's Isaiah chapter 66, verse 7 through 9. And this is a passage that is often quoted in the creation of the nation of Israel in 1948. The question of the passage is, can a country be born in a day, or a nation be brought forth in a moment? Yet no sooner is Zion in labor, see there's the figure again, no sooner is Zion in labor than she gives birth to her children. So this woman, Israel, in the tribulation period as a nation, is in travail, and from that comes a child. So let's look at it within the context of what has been going on. For the past 3.5 years of this last week of years, this 7-year period, you've had two witnesses that have been preaching. They've been tormenting the world with their message. Chapter 11. And in the midst of that week, after 3.5 years, the beast overcomes them and kills them. And their bodies lie in the street. Then God raises them from the dead in a resurrection, and in front of the whole world calls them up to heaven. So let's think about, there's your context. So Israel accepting Antichrist, he's built them a temple. Maybe they've already fought one great battle with the nations that didn't like the fact that you were building a temple on our property. And, he defeated them. Israel defeated them. They have a temple. They've restored their worship. They are not listening to anything about no Jesus for 3.5 years. And when Antichrist rises up and kills them, they're going to be there doing this with the rest of the world. But in a moment, all of that changes when these two prophets that they know are dead. They didn't pass out, get some kind of drug that just kind of knocked them out. No, they know that they're dead. Come back to life. And in front of the world in Israel, they're called up to heaven. As we've talked about, this is probably the tipping point. Probably in the figure of chapter 12, the birth of the Jewish revival. Of these people coming back to God. So, this revival is the unusual part of the birth of this woman. 2,000 years plus, depending on when all this takes place in the future, they have rejected Jesus Christ. But almost in a day or a moment, when these two witnesses come to life and ascend to heaven, they realized they were telling the truth. And Israel gives birth to the Jewish revival. It has been growing, if you will, to use the figure, for 3.5 years. It's been growing. Because they've had the message of the two witnesses, the 144,000 evangelists preaching and all this for 3.5 years. It's been growing in her, to keep with the figure. And she's in travail. Israel doesn't like that. She's in pain. But she gives birth to a believing remnant. Almost in a day. In a moment. Can you picture it? These two men coming back to life. And a voice calling out from heaven, come up here. And they're called away. Can you picture what the impact of that vision will be on everybody's little mobile device of whatever kind it is around the world when they see that? So in a moment, there's Jews all over the world that recognize, no, we've been following the wrong guy for 3.5 years. It's been this Jesus that we heard about, that these two prophets talked about. It's been this Jesus who is the real Messiah. And boom, you have a revival, unlike anything we've ever seen. The nearest thing to it would be like on the day of Pentecost, when this Jewish remnant is born. Now, the passage says this child will rule, verse 5, she gave birth to a son, a male child, who will rule all the nations, and her child was snatched up to God. This passage, he will rule all the nations, is a quote from Psalms 2, verses 8 and 9. And in that passage, it is a direct reference to Jesus Christ. But the passage time, its contextual time, is referencing Jesus in his second coming, not his first coming. He didn't rule the nations with a rod of iron in his first coming. That's in the second coming. And passages like Isaiah chapter 60, verses 11 through 14, and chapter 66, as well as Zechariah. This is a powerful passage. Zechariah chapter 14, verses 16 through 19. These passages, as others we could point to, talk about the prestige of Israel under the Messiah in the millennial age. They will have a king. David will sit upon the throne in the millennium of the nation of Israel. And all the nations of the earth will pay homage to the little nation of Israel. Little nation now, but they're going to be a big nation then, They will be the superpower of the earth, if you will, to use a phrase that, kind of brings it to our day. They will be the lead nation. So they will, under the authority of Jesus Christ, rule the nations. Nations that do not pay homage to Israel will suffer during the millennium. You can read it. Zechariah chapter 14, it's there. So, this reference here, she gave birth to a son, a male child, who will rule all the nations with an iron scepter. Yes, Jesus is the great authority, but under that authority is the nation of Israel that will be the nation of the millennium. And this believing remnant is snatched up to God and to his throne. That's why the word snatched becomes so important. They're not raptured. they are still here. But their spiritual birth is now protected. They're going to suffer physically, but their spiritual protection is now sealed, just like any believer's spiritual connection to God is sealed in salvation. So, this passage is speaking of more than just the birth of Jesus. And that's clear because neither he nor his parent was whisked away for 3.5 years in his first coming. So it doesn't fit. It doesn't fit to say this is just talking about Jesus. It doesn't fit with all the elements that are here. So once again, questions. And you're saying, will you ever finish this? Yeah. But it won't be this week. But this is the importance of this 12th chapter, because it really lays out and gives to us the birth of the Jewish revival. It lays out in almost synoptic form, a synopsis of what's going to be taking place from chapter 13 through chapter 18 all over the world, but in particular directed against the Jewish people and against every believer in Jesus Christ. So this is a powerful chapter, and if you can get a good handle on this chapter, you've got a good handle on the book of Revelation. At least I think so. So the next verse tells us that the woman fled into the desert where she might be taken care of for 1,260 days. So the woman, the child is the Jewish revival. These are believers. But the woman is still an unbeliever. She gives birth. That birth is separate from the woman who gave birth. I mean, that's, like duh. But she still is in a state of unbelief. But it's interesting that the woman, and it's stated, the woman fled. So, this woman is the remaining nation and people of the Jews that evidently still do not believe and follow Antichrist. They are still following him. They don't go tear the temple down simply because they've given birth to a Jewish revival. But they too will need protection. The remnant of Jews are protected by God by preparing a place for them in the wilderness. This is another example of what Paul is saying in Romans chapter 11, that passage that I read. And another interesting passage about why God acts as he does toward the Jews is Ezekiel chapter 36. I'll refer to that again. But in that chapter, God states that he has chosen his people as his nation, and he will protect that nation until they have the place that he has ordained for them in this world, the lead nation. Now, the woman fled into the desert to a place prepared for her. Is this a real place, or is this speaking symbolically? Probably both in some form. Some commentators and writers will say that the Jewish people are going to flee into the south of Israel, into the desert area, down around what is now Petra, and they will hide out there. But now, you're talking some millions of people that are left here. So that millions of them flee down into this area and are hidden, and who's left in the nation, I don't know that all that fits. It could happen that way. But probably part of them will flee, literally flee, as a result of the dragon's anger at these people, because, and we'll talk about this in more detail, but over the next 3.5 years, Antichrist and his false prophet will persecute the Jewish people as well as believers, until it all culminates in the final battle when the world is tired of both of them, Antichrist as well as the Jews, and there's the Battle of Armageddon, in which Israel will be destroyed, except for the fact that that's when Jesus comes back to earth. So the woman is Israel in the tribulation period. The child is the spiritual revival that is born most probably after the resurrection of the two witnesses of chapter 11. Okay, questions? We'll get into verses 3 and 4 next week and talk about the dragon. But questions, comments, statements, what abouts, if, and, or but? I know I've done a lot of just lecture with this, but I didn't hardly know any other way to do it than that, you know. So.
So you think that this whole chapter, this is symbolic, it's not literal.
I think some of it is symbolic. I think what we're seeing here is very much symbolic, although there could be some literalness of them fleeing into the desert. You know, I think that could be. I think we get into a literal, the literal part of the chapter begins in verse 7 and goes through verse 12 at least. I think that's a literal war that takes place. And we'll talk about why that is not symbolic. You know, there's the presentation of the passage basically helps us to understand that he's not talking symbolism here. He's actually talking a literal event. So the chapter has a blend of literalness as well as symbolism, which I think also makes it a hard chapter to really kind of figure out. But good point. Good question with that. Others?